I'm very honoured to be invited to speak here at the James Weldon Johnson Institute for Race and Difference. Now, James Weldon Johnson was a close colleague of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was active in trying to help these children born in Britain to black GIs, which is the subject of my talk today. I mean, Johnson, however, died in 1938, so precedes their story, but would, I feel sure, have been also concerned about their plight. So what drew me to this research? This appeared to be a history that's very largely unknown. Histories of the British experience of the Second World War are extensive, but they very rarely feature these war babies. Furthermore, in Britain, the arrival of the ship the Empire Windrush in 1948, you may not know of the Windrush, but that came over in 48 with several hundred people from the Caribbean, and then many, many more came in the 50s and 60s, also from the Indian subcontinent. That's generally assumed to be the starting point of the growth of a post-war black British population. But about 2,000 mixed race, or I think you say biracial, GI babies were born in Britain a few years prior to this arrival of this ship, the Windrush. And this may not sound a large number, but if we take into account that the pre-war British black population was an estimated 8,000, these children represented a not insignificant 25% increase in numbers of people of colour over a couple of years. And another reason I was drawn to this study of these wartime babies is more personal, because interracial relationships and mixed raceness are there in my own family, are kind of enriching diversity that may possibly be typical of many 21st century families. So I want to open my talk with a short video made in England by CNN that some of you may have seen, but I think it's worth a second look. This video, for which I was filmed too, but they thankfully cut me out, covers the spectrum of experiences of the many children now in their 70s interviewed for my recent book, which is up here. Just to say why it's called brown babies. In Britain, these children were known as half-caste, which is a horrible term, but the African-American press were very interested in this children's plight, and they called them the brown babies. So, and that was a term that's now being applied quite widely. Now, I suggested these four people to CNN for precisely the reason that they covered a spectrum of the experiences. And what do I mean by a spectrum? Well, someone who was kept by his mother, as in the case of Dave Greene, someone who was given up to a children's home and was adopted, as the case of Deborah Pryor, someone who was given up but never adopted, as in the case of Carol Edwards, and someone who was adopted by his father, as in the case of Leon Lomax, who I'm delighted to say is here today, having come all the way from Ohio. Thank you, Leon. In fact, it was very hard for these fathers to adopt their children. It was blocked by the American government, ostensibly because it went against the British Adoption Act of 1939, which stipulated that children could only be adopted by British subjects or by relatives, and as putative fathers only. I mean, DNA testing doesn't come into the late 60s. These fathers were not deemed relatives. There was one year, 1948, when some African Americans, including a few fathers, were permitted by the British to adopt these children, but then it was blocked again. The reason I believe, and there's all this back and forth between the Foreign Office and the Home Office and whatever, but the reason I believe was because the British government didn't want to be beholden to the Americans any more than it was already. There was kind of deep ambivalence about that special relationship. There was also deep ambivalence about the mere presence of black GIs in Britain. In August 1972, the British War Cabinet asserted, quote, that it was justified in pressing the United States Authority to reduce as far as possible the number of coloured troops sent to this country. And the following month, the Secretary of State for War presented the reasons for this position in his memorandum. Oh, there's Leon arriving. His memorandum, United States Coloured Troops in the United Kingdom. And you can see it says, to to be kept under lock and key, most secret. And it's great, and I'm reading it. This was obviously barred for the public to look at because of, it's a 70-year rule, and now I have access to it. Kept under lock and key because it is explicitly racist. In this document, they say the average white American soldier does not understand the normal British attitude to the colour problem, and his respect for this country may suffer if he sees British troops in the population generally drawing no distinction between white and coloured. This difference of attitude might clearly give rise to friction. Moreover, the coloured troops themselves probably expect to be treated in this country as in the United States, and a markedly different treatment might well cause political difficulties in America at the end of the war, which is precisely what happened, because I think quite a lot came back from the experience of the war, and it really fueled the civil rights movement. To carry on with this memorandum, finally, from the point of view of the morale of our own troops, it is most undesirable that there should be any unnecessary association between American coloured troops and British women. Now, attached to this memo was a paper headed Notes on Relations with Coloured Troops, written by a particular Major General, which asserts white women should not associate with coloured men. It follows then that they should not walk out, dance, or drink with them. But dancing and drinking with black GIs, particularly at dances known as black dances and at segregated pubs, were where local women did meet black GIs. Americans brought their segregation policies with them, and the army stayed segregated, as you know, to 1948. And certain pubs were designated black pubs for the duration of the war, others white, and there would be dances one night for black GIs, the next night for white GIs. And the rationale behind this was this anxiety about the tension, and of course white GIs would be very affronted by black GIs even talking to white women, and it led to a lot of violence, which was just allowed to pass with impunity. So the British government may not have wanted black GIs to come to Britain, but come they did. The exact number is not known. Roosevelt had pledged to black American leaders that 10% of the wartime troops would be African American. However, of those who came to Britain, the figure was probably nearer 8%. Now, approximately 3 million American troops passed through Britain in the period 42 to 45, which gives for black GIs a figure the region of 240,000, though, of course, never that number at any one time. On arrival, the general public generally greeted the black GIs with enthusiasm, and as the writer George Orwell expressed it, quote, the general consensus of opinion appears to be that the only American soldiers with decent manners are the Negroes. And of course, Negro was the term of the time. And as a West Country farmer, that's from sort of Somerset area, was said to have expressed his thoughts along these lines: I love the Americans, but I don't like those white ones they brought with them. So white GIs, in contrast, were often thought brash and boastful, although all the GIs were commended for their generosity, and they earned 5 times more than a British equivalent. And they handed out what were known as the 4 Cs. Oh, sorry, that's a picture of, I keep forgetting to move it on. Just to show you black troops marching centre of London in Somerset. These are known as the 4 Cs: cigarettes, candy, which we call chocolate, chewing gum, and Coca-Cola, and nylons, stockings, which for women suffering rationing was a huge treat, because women were kind of dyeing their legs beige coloured and putting a line up the back, like people did with on their stockings. I went to the Coca-Cola Museum yesterday, and I realised that it's probably the first time that the British had seen Coca-Cola, and of course not the last time. Now, Britons emphasised their racial tolerance in contrast to the Americans, and as African-American journalist Roy Otto observed, quote, the average Englishman, as I came to know him, relishes the luxury of denouncing racial prejudice in America. Often he is snootily superior about the Americans' inability to solve the Negro problem. But to Otley, quote, British racial prejudice is often more subtle than prejudice in the US. Now, he had visited Britain during the war, and he'd registered attitudes firsthand. British prejudice was not so subtle when it came to black servicemen forming relationships with local women. So Otto, quote, notwithstanding the widespread Negro associations with white women in the British Isles and a public tolerance seemingly, Englishmen have a deeply ingrained horror of such relations. And he called it England's racial double talk. Hypocrisy, one could call it too. For although Britons stressed their tolerance, they did not necessarily condone intimacy, indeed were often hostile to interracial sex and marriage. If the British government didn't want black GIs to fraternise with British women, neither did many of the public. So most were committed to being kind of friendly, polite, and welcoming hosts, but British men and the older generation of women drew the line at sexual relations. If women in relations with black GIs went on to have a child, they faced a barrage of criticism. The children born to black GIs and British women in the war were nearly all illegitimate. This would, of course, have been the case where the mother or father was already married to someone else, but even where couples were single and wanted to marry, their child was born out of wedlock. Now, every American serviceman had to get permission to marry from his commanding officer, who in Britain was nearly all white, and avoidance of that permission was a court-martial defence. But for a black GI wanting to marry a white British woman, permission was invariably refused. According to black former GI Ormus Davenport, writing after the war, the US Army unofficially had a gentleman's agreement, which became in practice official policy. The agreement said, no Negro soldier or sailor will be given permission to marry any British white girl. Not one GI bride going back to the US under the US government scheme is the wife of a Negro. And you can see all those with their children, not that many children, but they're all white children. And as historian Brenda Gale Plummer has suggests, US military authorities had considerable difficulty in recognizing the capacity and right of the African-American men under their control to father. To the American authorities, responsible fatherhood indicated civic entitlement and respectability, the distinction between fathering, as a free man would, and siring, as done by a slave or an animal. So they could not or would not see black servicemen as truly free men, and as with slaves, they denied legitimate black paternity. And back in the United States, of what were then 48 states, 30 had anti-miscegenation laws that forbade marriage between whites and blacks, and of course in the whole of the South. Presumably babies born to white GIs would on occasion have been passed off as the offspring of husbands if the dates roughly fitted. This initially was the case with one of my interviewees, Babs, born in October 44. Her mother was married. Her husband, quote, was in the Navy, and when he came back from being at sea, he honestly believed I was his child. I think because my complexion at the time was very fair, it took 6 months for my complexion to change. She was then packed off to Dr. Bernardo's home in Suffolk. In 1945, a baby on the hospital ward of Nurse Johnson in West Bromwich, that's in the Midlands, was noticeably brown-skinned from birth. Writing a diary for Mass Observation. Mass Observation was a British social research organisation set up in 1937 to record everyday life through volunteers writing diaries and doing questionnaires. Anyway, she records that the baby, quote, had been getting darker complexioned each day. The mother had been getting very worried about it, and today she became hysterical and said its father was a black American soldier. The husband had been looking at the baby very intently during the last day or two, and it was decided that the best thing to do was tell him the truth. So the mother went home with her husband, but without the baby. The black American fathers, the white British mothers, and the children born of these relationships were all regularly treated with contempt. Some of the men were accused of rape, accusations that may very well have been false. For in July 44, The Crisis, which was the paper of the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, reported, quote, a white Southern lieutenant, I think you say lieutenant, in a Negro anti-aircraft company who just couldn't stand to see his men enjoying the courtesies extended by the white women of a certain Western town. He posted a notice that any type of association with white women is regarded as rape, and reminded his men that the penalty for rape during wartime is death. Thus, any relationship between a black GI and a white British woman could have been construed as rape, the justification, as you well know, having been used for years for lynching in the American South. Joe, who had been put in a children's home, found out later that his maternal grandparents had identified his black GI to the commanding officer, and they clearly wanted him to take responsibility. But when his father said he wished to keep his newborn child, he was told if he maintained a relationship with the mother, he would be charged with rape. The mothers of children born to black GIs were often treated badly as well. A number of their children mentioned the hostility and stigma their mothers faced and the taunts. Monica Roberts' mother often got called names in the street. Quote, I remember one time there was a lady from a couple of doors away. Her and Mum never got on. I remember one day Mum and me were sat on the gate where we lived, and this lady came past and hit my mum and shouted abuse. Terry recalls some people, quote, would bang on their metal dustbins whenever my mother walked by. It became a daily ritual for people to cross the road to avoid my mother rather than speak to her. When Carol B was born in December, and I'm afraid she hasn't got any photographs, in December 44 to a white mother and a black GI, her mother was disowned by her family. Carol remembers, my mother's family, they just shunned her. It was horrible. I can remember walking down the street with her, and she said hello to them, and they just ignored her. Henry's memory of his mother being spat at for having a black child was probably not uncommon. Despite all this abuse, over half the babies were kept by mothers or grandmothers, often came and helped, often in the face of extreme opposition and no financial aid. The children also had a difficult time in the 30s. In the 30s and 40s, Britain was very largely a white country. Numbers of black people rose greatly during the war, not only because of the presence of black GIs, but also because of West Indians coming to contribute to the war effort as service personnel, especially in the RAF, and as munition workers. Nevertheless, soon after the war, numbers shrank back again for the next few years, although never back to the pre-war number. So most of Britain remained white, and particularly the areas where these children were born, which was sort of, I don't know if you know the geography of Britain, but East Anglia along the south coast, southwest, very white areas, rural areas. Many of the mixed-race GI children suffered racism, acute sense of difference, and a lack of racial belonging. Now, there's a long and ugly history of hostility, not only towards interracial relationships, but towards the so-called half-caste. I don't know if it's a term you have in America, but this horrible term was used in Britain. In 1937, a polemic entitled Half-Caste by self-defined Euro-Asian Cedric Dover, while claiming, quote, the richness of hybrid potentiality, also indicated the extent of prejudice facing those of mixed race. Quote, the half-caste appears in a prodigal literature. It presents him mostly as an undersized, scheming, and entirely degenerate bastard. His father is a blackguard, his mother a whore. But more than all this, he is a potential menace to Western civilization, to everything that is white and sacred. So the existence of so-called half-castes represented a challenge to national and racial boundaries and to the neat polarity between the white British and the non-white colonized racial other. Visiting African-American anthropologist John Sinclair Drake, now he was someone that came over to do his PhD in England on race relations in Britain. He came in 1947, and he was aware of how such children couldn't be hidden away. He put it, the high visibility of the coloured illegitimate child made him so conspicuous that the onlooker could not forget what he symbolised. And what he or she symbolised was that the black GIs had indeed lived up to the last two attributes of the caricature of all the GIs, that they were overpaid, overfed, oversexed, and over here. I don't know if you know what the Brits were called in return. They were called underpaid, underfed, undersexed, and under Eisenhower. The children were taunted for being illegitimate, black, and different, including being a Yanks child. Monica remembers having a row with a girl in the street when I was about 13. She said to me, you should go home. You're not one of us. You're a Yanks kid. Monica didn't know what this meant. Indeed, didn't know at this stage that she had an American father. She was not atypical in not knowing about her father. Those who were adopted were sometimes not even told they were adopted. This was the case with Anne Evans. So she's in the front, and she was one who was one of the ones that was sent to Honeycott House, and I've interviewed her. And she was happily adopted, age 5. We had a conversation one day in school about Mary, this other girl of mixed race in the area. "You know her father's American, Anne." I said, "I know, he's an American soldier." So the other girl said, "Perhaps that's why you're that colour, Anne. Your dad's American." I said, "No, he's in the house." My adoptive parents, and she could have blocked it out, my adoptive parents, who were white, never told me a thing until I was 13, and this elderly lady said to me that I should go back where I belong, and I said, "And where's that supposed to be? You ends are all the same," she said, "and Mr. and Mrs. Greeno are not your mother and father." So that's how she found out. Some children, however, were told that they had Black American fathers, and on occasion took great pride in the fact. Jennifer Brown, who lived with her grandmother, went on a school trip in 1959, when she was 14, to Stratford-upon-Avon to see Shakespeare's Othello. After the show, she was lucky enough to meet Paul Robeson, who had been playing Othello. He singled her out. She's obviously the only Black child in the audience. I said, "My dad was American, you know." And he said, and she mimics the voice, "Was he?" "Oh, like that, very beautiful voice. I met Paul Robeson, had a kiss off him. I don't think I washed my face for weeks." I was absolutely over the moon. And her grandmother used to sing "My Curly-Headed Baby" when she was young, which is a lullaby that Robeson had recorded in 1948. Most of the children born to Black GIs in Britain knew next to nothing about their fathers, and the little they were told was often inaccurate or misleading. It was difficult enough not knowing who their fathers were, but the difficulty was often exacerbated by learning that their fathers were American, because America seemed impossibly far away. Few were as lucky as Jennifer in meeting a famous Black American. As already suggested, even where a mother kept her child, she often wouldn't fully answer questions about the child's father. While her mother may have loved the man, she usually believed there was no future with him and that she and her child had to make a life without him. Negating him or playing down his existence was one common strategy. Many of the mothers, as Monika reflects, went to the grave and just absolutely refused to give the name of the man. It seemed to be just the same for most of us. Consequently, many of Britain's so-called brown babies did not start looking for their fathers for many years. The barriers seemed too great. In the 1980s, 2 organizations were set up to try and help find US fathers: War Babes, founded by white GI baby Shirley MacLaide, and Trace, which is now online and renamed GI Trace. In trying to obtain information about her father in the 1980s, MacLaide came up against enormous barriers, as did all the GI babies. This was, of course, long before the arrival of email and the internet. But the greatest barrier was the stonewalling by the US military. One of the US military's excuses for refusing to help was that records had been burnt in 1973 at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, the fire destroying approximately 80% of the military personnel records for Army veterans discharged between 1912 and 1960. There were no backup records, but remnants from the fire had been retrieved, and it didn't affect all military veterans. However, the US Army refused to indulge any information invoking privacy law. With great determination, Shirley MacLaide, aided by several US civil rights lawyers, took on the Department of Defense in 1990, and the law was changed. From then on, the US military was obliged to help under Freedom of Information legislation. And with the recent and extensive use of DNA testing, finding US relatives is now proving a great deal easier, although it's rare to find a father still alive because they would be well into their 90s. DNA, along with the now helpful NPRC, is transforming the success rate of those seeking their US relatives. When he was young, James Andrews asked his mother about his father. But, quote, "My mother always said I was not to ask questions in front of Reg," that's his stepfather, "because it wouldn't be fair, it would be rude, so I didn't ask any more." Reg died in 1985, and sometime later, James's daughter galvanized him into searching for his father. He got his original birth certificate and found his father had registered him, so his army number was included. So in about 2000, with the help of GI Trace, James found his father. That first moment when James talked to his father on the telephone, quote, "It was a great relief. Up to that point, I never felt whole. There was a part of me missing, and finding my dad was that part. And then I felt whole. I felt better and settled. Every member of his family knew about me. He never kept his secret. He produced a photograph, which he carried around. And he hoped that one day I would try and find him." We were both choked up. Me, my dad. My mum said, my dad cried, "That's my American mum," his stepmother. "I call her mum." He cried a lot. James went out and visited him every year, and his father came to England, and his father lived till 2 years ago to age 95, and they had a wonderful relationship. Now, Dave Greene, who we saw on the programme, he was unusual, and he was always told about his father by his mother. But he didn't look for him until 1999. And he had a friend, Chris, who was a Mormon, and he said he'd help him find him. Now, the Mormons, you may know this, the Church of, called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they own the world's largest genealogical database, which is run by a non-profit company, Family Search. And why do they have this? Because their founder in the 19th century, Joseph Smith, preached the need for church members to offer baptism to all their ancestors, hence the need to trace their lineages. Now, via access to this database, quote, Chris had given me this list of possibles with the name Greene, so his name is Greene with an E at the end, in different parts of the States. And I phoned this guy, and I had in my mind that my father's name was David Otis Greene. Mum always thought his middle name was Otis. I get this list of names. I think, well, okay, I'll go through them. I phoned a couple, and I said, do you mind me asking, is your husband African-American? No, he's white. And then I spoke to this guy. I said, I'm calling from England. I'm trying to locate David Otis Greene.
Can you speak a little louder in the microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry. Has this been a problem all along? Yes. I'm so sorry. You should, oh, dear. I'm so sorry. Okay, is that better? Yeah. Yeah. So I said, I spoke to this guy saying, I'm calling from England. I'm trying to locate David Otis Greene. My name's David Otto Greene, angry voice. And he was really stroppy about it, came across really stroppy, quite a refined voice. I thought, crikey, I had a vision of a Germanic person on the other end of the phone getting quite stroppy. I said, okay, sorry to have troubled you. Dave got a bit more information about where his father was likely to be living, and a few months later he rang this number again. The guy's in Brooklyn, New York. Phone rings. He picks up. The news is on. Don't you know the news is on? Yeah, but I'm phoning from England. I'm looking for David Otis Greene. I'm David Otto Greene. I said, well, I'm phoning from Yeovil in Somerset. Were you there during the war? Well, yeah, I was. Do you know Joan Bagwell? Yeah, I do. That's my mum. You're my dad. 2.5 hours later, they were still chatting. And then Dave flew out to the US. And being able to meet his father, who was like in so many ways, was really life-changing to Dave. Monika's mother was very evasive when asked about Monika's father, saying that he died in the war. However, she did eventually tell Monika his name. He was called Paris Mack. I used to spend hours daydreaming. I wondered where he was. Is he alive? What's he look like? Has he got married? Has he got a family? There was that permanent sadness. All I knew, he was Paris Mack and lived in America. I got to 58. I thought about Dad occasionally, but hadn't done anything. That year, 2002, her son showed her how to use a computer. He said, well, give me the name of something you want information on. I said, my dad's name, Paris Mack. He knew the GI story and all the background, but it's nothing we talked about anymore. It's been so long ago. Anyway, he put it in. He said, look, Mum, found him. And I said, oh, yeah. He said, no, come and look. And I walked over and looked at the computer screen, and there was like a sort of official form. It was a Social Security death index. He died in 1994, 8 years previously. Don't touch it. I had a moment then. I don't know, like the breath left my body. He said, I won't touch it. It won't go away. I can get it back. There was a military number. I wrote to the National Personnel Records Centre. I got a reply back. He'd had 2 sisters that were older than him who were still alive in their 80s, Lola and Edna. No wife's name on it. There were no children at his funeral. So I rang one night. I kept putting it off. I'd been given the number from the girl in the library, and an elderly lady answered. She had a deep Southern accent. Oh, it was wonderful. So just like quite a lot of Americans like English accents, a lot of English like Southern accents. Sorry, where we got to now. But it was a bit difficult because she was hard of hearing. She couldn't understand a lot, and then she got confused. The phone went dead. This happened a few times. Anyway, the phone didn't get answered for a week, and I thought, oh, I've blown it. So I started ringing the other sister. But again, she was very elderly. It was hard for her. I said, is there anyone else I can speak to? So I phoned back whenever it was, and this other lady said, I don't know what you're ringing here for, but this is a joke. Paris has died, and stop ringing and upsetting my mum. Anyway, the phone got put down again. Didn't go very well. I was floundering. But I rang back the first address and left a message on the answer phone. I said, my name is Monika. This is my telephone number. I'm calling from the UK. Paris was friendly with my family when he was over. If anyone could get in touch with me. It took a few days, but one day my phone rang at home. And then a voice, southern but younger, said, "Hi, I'm Judy. I'm Edna's daughter. You've been calling. We thought it was a joke." I decided to go for it at this point. "I believe Paris Mack was my father." She said, "Your father? What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you know he was a veteran in World War II and he was in England. I was born in 44. All my life I've been waiting for this moment." She said, "Oh my God, can this be real?" I said, "It's a lot to tell you in a phone call. Can I write to you?" I sat down and wrote this letter off, told her about myself, that I searching for my dad. I sent a bunch of pictures. She phoned back when she got these things. She said, "Oh my gosh, you're my cousin, you're my biological cousin, and you're English." She believed it straight away. If my health had been okay, I would have tried to go and see his grave, just to stand there where he was buried. He was born in Mississippi, to go down to that place. I felt a deep connection to him. She sent me photographs of him and the family, and it was like all my birthdays and Christmases came at once when I looked at that. My daughter walked in and looked at it. This is a photo we're going to show you in a moment of Monika's dad. And she just burst into sobs. I said, "What? Tell me." "Oh my God, it's you," but in a male sort of face. Now, don't they look alike? Monika feels it has transformed her life. "I'm so joyful, I don't actually need anything else. That's my dad. I know who I am. It just wipes out all the pain, all the emptiness, full circle, peace and joy." Now, I'm going to move on and not talk about Carol, just to say that she's just found who her father was. Unfortunately, she's been searching for 40 years. She's now got this picture from the military people, but she's found some relatives, but they're not responding to her. But as you can imagine, it's quite difficult if you suddenly, out of the blue, appear and say, "Look, I think I'm your half-sister," or whatever. And you have to do it really carefully. And I think she might have sort of blundered in a bit, and they're just not responding. These stories are greatly moving, as well as demonstrating impressive perseverance in the face of huge obstacles. Finding their fathers or relatives, or simply seeing photographs, gave the so-called brown babies a sense of completeness and often racial pride that many had lacked. They felt a sense of wholeness, and the connection to the United States is a central part of what they see as their long-lost heritage. Being partly American is crucial to the identity of many of them, even where no relatives have yet been found. And the people I've been interviewing, some are even now finding relatives because of DNA. I asked them how they identify themselves on the census form. In the 2001 census, we have a census every 10 years, mix was first introduced as a category, with the choices white and black Caribbean, white and black African, white and Asian, and any other mixed background. There's no box for white and African American. Most tick other, then put African American. James, for example, commented it. I often, with those boxes, put Anglo, black, African American. I love putting that in other, just to throw one back at them. So, to conclude, the black GIs who'd come to Britain in the 1940s were initially received very positively. Once they started to have relationships with local women, attitudes changed. As children were born of these relationships, hostility grew. The black GIs, the British women of their children, and the children themselves were frequently demonized. While more than half the mothers or grandmothers kept these children, and often very bravely, the others were put in children's homes, and actually very few were adopted because adoption societies wouldn't take them on their books. They said they're too hard to place. Appalling. Where mothers were already married, the child was sometimes kept, with or without the husband still in tow, but the majority of cases the child were relinquished, the child seen as an accident of the upheavals and excitement of war. Everyone was labeling the children a problem. But in what way were these children a problem? Was it their illegitimacy? Of course, illegitimacy then was a big, big stigma, okay? Was it their non-whiteness? Was it their being the sign of miscegenation of interracial relations? Was it their viewed outsideness? Their being thought not properly British? Their lack of belonging? But of course, that lack of belonging was imposed on these children. The problem was the culture these children was entering. And the problem of belonging was made worse for the children through lacking their fathers. Even where mothers kept their mixed-race children, the father was rarely thought of as part of their and their child's future. Years later, however, the children, now adults, often middle-aged, want desperately to find the fathers they never knew. They embarked on a search that for some led them to their fathers, or at least to their American relatives. half-siblings, cousins, uncles, aunts. Meeting their American fathers or relatives, or simply seeing photographs, as in Monika's case, has given them a sense of wholeness. Sandy Hughes, who had been placed in a children's home by her married mother, to quote, "I had no history of my own. I needed to know all this and to understand it." And finding her father's American wife, and hearing that finding her father's American wife, and hearing that her father, who had now died, always talked of her, was a turning point. I was like tumbleweed, you know, when you see those cowboy films and the tumbleweeds just blowing about where the wind takes it. I was like that, and I was aware of it, but I didn't know how to change it. And it's about roots. It's your roots that stabilize you. So Sandy's new sense of rootedness demonstrates clearly that a sense of belonging is not simply about where you grew up or live or how you feel placed in the world, but is also about your story of origin. And finding about fathers so late in life, though, was bittersweet, a mixed blessing. To Elaine, whose story I haven't told here, the whole experience has been for her, quote, a joyful heartache, but also a painful heartache. When you do find out about your father, you realize all that you missed. As Monika expressed it, it's just such a pity it took me till I was so old before I found anything out about my dad. Thank you so much.